My son-in-law looked at me across the table at the Christmas barbecue and told me, in front of my own daughter and his parents, that I was holding her back from the life she deserved. Said the cottage was falling apart. Said I was getting forgetful. Said there were lovely places up in Tauranga where men of my age could be properly looked after. He said it the way a man reads out a verdict, with the small, confident smile of someone who'd already decided how the conversation ended. What my son-in-law Marcus Pendleton didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to learn in the 5 years he'd been married to my Annabel, was that I owned the harbourside complex his accounting firm had its top-floor offices in, the warehouses behind it that his biggest client leased for storage, and a string of commercial buildings stretching from Mission Bay all the way through to Devonport. When his mother passed me a glossy brochure for a retirement village out in Bethlehem and said it would be such a relief for everyone, I just nodded. Took a sip of my beer. Told her I'd give it some thought. That night I made 2 phone calls. Marcus Pendleton spent the next 6 weeks finding out that the quietest bloke at the table is usually the one you should have been listening to. My name is Hugh Larkin. I'm 63 years old. I drive a 1998 Toyota Hilux Ute with a dent in the tailgate I never got round to pulling out, and I've worn the same brand of black work boots for 32 years because I found the pair that fit and saw no reason to go looking for another. I keep a folding ruler in the back pocket of my trousers because that's where it's always lived, even though it's been a long while since I needed it for anything but measuring the kitchen bench when Margaret asked. The neighbors in our little stretch of Devonport reckon I'm a retired builder. The blokes at the Returned Servicemen's Club think I'm a widower scraping by on the pension and what's left of my super. Marcus thinks I'm an embarrassment. None of them have ever sat down and properly asked what I do with my Tuesdays and my Fridays. My wife Margaret passed 11 years ago now. Pancreatic, diagnosed in late autumn. Gone before the daffodils came up. She was 56, and she was the cleverest person I ever stood beside. For the 31 years we were married, she was the only one I ever told the whole truth to about anything that mattered. After we lost her, I kept running the firm the way we always had, which is to say without telling anyone who didn't strictly need to know. Margaret used to say, the man who needs a stranger to know what he's worth has already shown the stranger he doesn't believe it himself. I believed her then. I still do. Larkin Holdings Limited. We own and manage commercial property across Auckland, Hamilton, and the Eastern Bay of Plenty. 26 titles all up, office blocks, a couple of medical centers, a small industrial park in Penrose, and the harbourside development on Quay Street that we put together back in 2010 when half the country still thought the city was finished after the recession. Current portfolio value sits somewhere just north of 74 million New Zealand dollars, give or take what the property market does on a given week. My general manager is a sharp woman named Tapaya Wairapa, who's been with me 15 years and runs the daily side of things better than I ever did. I come into the office on Tuesdays and Fridays, look over the numbers, sign what needs signing, and head home. None of the staff dress the way I dress. They learned early on not to pass remarks about it. Annabel, my daughter, is 33. She's got her mother's same way of tilting her head when she's listening, and her mother's way of trusting people she loves, a little past the point where the trust has been earned. She met Marcus at a charity auction 5 years back. He was 32 then, a senior associate at Brearley Cox in Whitfield, one of the better-known accounting firms across the harbor. Tall, well-spoken, the sort of man who shakes your hand while his eyes are already drifting to whoever else has just walked in. I saw what he was the first time. She brought him round to the cottage for a Sunday roast. I didn't say a word about it, because Margaret had drilled into me long before that the surest way to push a daughter towards a fellow is to tell her you don't fancy him. So I watched. The first year of their marriage was civil enough. Marcus made the right noises, asked polite questions about my background. I told him I'd done a bit of building, a bit of property management, kept the answer dull on purpose. He never asked a follow-up. People who are properly curious always ask the second question. Marcus would nod and steer the talk back to whatever firm he was angling to make partner at, which told me everything I needed to know about where he kept his attention. They had a small wedding out at a winery in Matakana. I paid the lot of it without saying so. Annabel believed she was using money her mother had set aside in a savings account at the BNZ. She wasn't, but I saw no reason to set her straight on the matter. In their second year, Marcus made senior partner. His pay packet went from $110,000 to $240,000. Near enough overnight, and I watched the change come over him, the way I'd watched it settle on plenty of younger blokes who suddenly came into more money than they'd properly earned the right to. He leased a Range Rover. They moved out of the flat in Ponsonby and bought a 4-bedroom in Remuera that they could only just stretch to, provided nothing went sideways. They started having dinners with people who spoke about their Bach in the Coromandel, the way most blokes speak about their footy team. By their third year, Annabel mentioned at Easter lunch that Marcus had been having a good look at my cottage. My cottage is a 1,924 villa in Old Devonport. 2 bedrooms and a sleep-out, board and batten, and original Kari floors. I sanded back myself. The winter we lost Margaret, because I needed something to do with my hands at 4 in the morning. I bought it in 1989 for $142,000 when my mates told me I was mad to pay that much for a place in a suburb that was still half rough. I renovated it across 3 years, doing most of the work after my proper job had finished for the day. Margaret loved that cottage. She planted the camellias along the front path and painted the veranda ceiling that pale blue they call karakari blue down here, said it kept the bad weather off the porch. When she passed, you couldn't have shifted me out of that house with a bulldozer. The suburb had changed quite a bit around me. What had been a working-class pocket in '89 was now one of the most sought-after addresses on the North Shore. My cottage, with its cowrie and its sea glimpse, and the little workshop out the back I built with my own 2 hands, was worth somewhere between $1.5 and $1.7 million, depending on which agent you asked that month. Marcus knew this. He'd looked it up. He started in with the comments around the time he found the council valuation. Soft at first. "Father, have you thought about something a bit more manageable? Father, the maintenance on a place that age must be a real ongoing cost, mustn't it? Father, the rates alone on a property like that would be eating into your retirement." I gave him the same answer every time. Told him I was comfortable, that the cottage was freehold, that I liked the bowls club down the road and the takeaway shop on the corner. He'd nod and look across the table at Annabel, in that particular silent way couples have of finishing an argument with their eyes. The dinner where the whole thing tipped over happened a fortnight before Christmas. Marcus had just had his name put forward for a board position at the Auckland Chamber of Commerce. It was a celebration barbecue at their place in Remuera. Annabel, doing the lamb the way her mother had taught her, Marcus uncorking a Central Otago Pinot that cost more than my weekly grocery bill, and talking for the better part of an hour about what the chamber appointment meant for his career trajectory. His parents had flown up from Christchurch for it. Jeffrey and Diana Pendleton both retired from running a chain of carpet showrooms down south. Jeffrey had the comfortable, slightly loud manner of a man who'd sold enough flooring to believe he understood property in a way the rest of us couldn't. Halfway through the lamb, Jeffrey put it on the table. "Hugh, I'll be straight with you, mate. Because we're family now. That cottage of yours is sitting on a small fortune. You release that equity, you'd set yourself up handsomely in one of the better villages. Have you been to Bethlehem Country Club out Tauranga way? Marvelous spot. My brother went in there 2 winters ago, hasn't looked back. I told him I wasn't keen on a retirement village. I'm 63. I walk the length of North Head 3 mornings a week. I split my own firewood." He laughed as if I'd cracked a joke. Marcus cleared his throat. "Father, Dad's right. Annabel and I have been having a proper conversation about this. The cottage is a significant asset. And honestly, given your situation, it makes more sense to release the value now than to let it tie itself up. We could help you manage the whole process. Make sure the agent gets you the best price. My situation. I asked him what exactly he meant by my situation. Marcus set his glass down with the careful slowness of a man choosing every word. Father, you're on a fixed income. You're on your own out there. The cottage needs work. The piles have settled on the western side. The wiring's likely original, and you're paying rates every year on a place too big for one man. Annabel and I have the resources now to take on a property like that. We could restore it properly. Use it to build something to pass down. Something for the grandchildren when they come. Something to pass down. Built with my money, kept up with my money, on a piece of ground I'd held the title to for 34 years. I asked him when he'd had the piles assessed. He hesitated. We had a chap take a look. A few weeks back. Just to understand what we'd be inheriting. Eventually, they'd sent a builder onto my property without telling me. I picked up my fork and kept eating. Told them I'd think about it. Diana smiled at me with the warmth of a woman who reckoned she'd just done me a real kindness. Jeffrey topped up my wine without asking. Marcus nodded at Annabel, satisfied, like a thing had been put properly to bed. I drove home that night, sat on the veranda under Margaret's Karakare blue ceiling, and I thought about the way Marcus had said the word inheriting, like it was a foregone conclusion, like I was a hurdle in a plan, rather than the man who'd built every brick of what the plan was reaching for. I went to bed. In the morning, I rang Tapaya. Tapaya Wayarpa has been my general manager for 15 years, and she knows the workings of Larkin Holdings better than I do at this stage. She picked up on the second ring. I want a full review of the lease at Brearley Cox and Whitfield, I said. Top 3 floors at 1 Quay. Renewals coming up in March. I want a market rate analysis with no grandfathering. And I want it on my desk. By Thursday, there was the faintest pause down the line. Hugh, is this about your son-in-law? I told her it was about running a portfolio properly. She made the small sound she makes when she's choosing not to argue with me, and said she'd have it by Wednesday lunchtime. My second call was to my solicitor, a man named Brendan Maytai Walters, who I've worked with 20 years, and who has the gift of being unable to be flustered by anything. Brendan, I said, I want a full going over of my estate, the trust structure, the property holdings, the succession deeds, the lot. And I want to know what my position is if anyone tries to make a legal argument about my capacity to manage my own affairs. Brendan asked who was making that argument. I told him no one. Yet, I wanted to be ready before they were. He said he'd shift his Monday. I want to explain something here. Because I know how it sounds. It sounds as though I went out of my way to keep my family in the dark for some calculated reason of my own. The truth is plainer than that, and harder to put across to people who count relationships in dollars. Margaret and I made a decision together, right back when Annabel was still in nappies, that we'd live on what we needed, save the rest, and never let money decide how the world looked at us or how we looked at ourselves. We drove practical cars. We ate fish and chips on Friday like everyone else. We gave to St. John and to the local hospice without putting our names on a plaque. And we raised Annabel in a household where she earned her pocket money, took a part-time job at a bakery in Devonport from the age of 15, and came up understanding that her mom and dad were comfortable without ever properly grasping what comfortable meant. That was on purpose. We wanted her to know who she was before she had any reason to wonder what she was worth. I reckon it worked. Annabel is hardworking and decent and turned out kind. The trouble was never with Annabel. A fortnight after the barbecue, a registered letter turned up on my doormat. It was from a property lawyer up in Christchurch I didn't know from a bar of soap. on letterhead that told me Jeffrey Pendleton had been making a few phone calls of his own. The letter said that, in light of my age, my sole occupancy of a property considerably above my demonstrated income, and the potential benefits to my financial security and physical well-being, my family was prepared to assist me in transitioning to more suitable accommodation. There was a proposed timeline. There was wording about ensuring I received appropriate care as I aged, and there was a paragraph I had to read 3 times to be sure I wasn't reading more into it than was there. The paragraph said that, should I decline to engage with this process voluntarily, my family was prepared to explore legal options to secure my welfare and the responsible administration of my estate. Legal options. I put the letter down on the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Annabel with her school certificate maths, and I felt something quiet inside me. Not anger so much as the calm you feel when the wind drops just before a real southerly comes through. I rang Annabel. She picked up sounding flustered. "Father, hey. Is everything all right?" I asked her if she'd seen the letter. She paused. "Marcus said he was getting some advice. He said it was for your benefit." I asked her if she'd read the letter. Another pause. "Not the whole thing." I told her the letter threatened legal action to have me removed from my own home. She said that wasn't the way Marcus had framed it to her. I told her I understood. I told her I loved her and that I'd be in touch. She started to say, "Father, hold on." And I could hear Marcus's voice somewhere in the background of her kitchen, and I rang off. I drove into the city the next day, to the office on Key Street that none of my family has ever set foot inside, and Tapaya and Brendan and I sat in the boardroom for 3 hours and went through what was going to happen next. The opportunity came along 3 weeks later. Marcus had been confirmed for the Chamber of Commerce Board, and there was a midsummer mixer at the Northern Club on Princes Street. 80 or so people, accountants, lawyers, a couple of MPs, the usual collection of the city's well-fed. Annabel had rung twice to make sure I was coming. I told her I wouldn't miss it for the world. I wore my brown moleskins and a checked shirt and my old swandry over the top because the weather was a bit changeable. The same folding ruler in my back pocket. By habit, I drove the Hilux into town and parked in the building off Shortland Street that takes $32 off you for the evening, which is mine, although I didn't think about it until I was already walking away. The Northern Club's function room was warm and golden lit, full of the particular hum of professionally ambitious people networking at full clip. I got a soda water from the bar and found a spot near a window where I could look out at the harbor and let the room arrange itself. Annabel found me first. She looked beautiful and tense, which is how she tends to look at Marcus's events. She hugged me tight and whispered close to my ear, "Father, please don't let him start anything tonight." I told her I had no intention of starting a single thing. That was perfectly true. Marcus worked the room for 40 minutes before he came over. When he did, he had 2 other men with him, both partners at competing firms, and he wore the faint smile of a man who was about to make a small show of something. "Father, glad you came along. You'll remember Owen Brearley, my managing partner." I shook Owen Brearley's hand. I'd known Owen at a distance for a decade. He didn't know me from a chimney. "And this is Donald Kerr, from Kerr Whitlock Property. They handle commercial acquisitions across Auckland and the Waikato." Donald Kerr shook my hand with the half-distracted polish of a man who'd already filed me under not useful. "So, Father," Marcus said, "what's been keeping you busy these days?" I told him a bit of property work, a bit of light consulting. Marcus smiled across at Owen and Donald with the patient, faintly amused tolerance of a man minding an elderly relative. Father's been in the building trades most of his career. Honest, hard yaka. He's been thinking about simplifying things a bit. "Aren't you, Father?" Looking at one of the villages out Tauranga way. Owen said the Tauranga developments were coming along nicely. Donald said he'd heard good things about the Bethlehem precinct. I sipped my soda water. I said, Donald, what sort of acquisitions does Kerr Whitlock concentrate on these days? He launched into it the way a man does when you hand him the floor. Commercial and mixed use mostly. We've been having a hard look at the Key Street and Britomart fringes. Plenty of upside left in that corridor. The trouble is the existing ownership in some of the better stock is tightly held. Hard to put a continuous block together for a serious buyer. I asked which buildings, specifically, he had in mind. He named 4. 3 of them are mine. The 4th I had a right of first refusal on through a nominee company. Marcus was listening to Donald with the slightly bored expression of a man waiting for the conversation to swing back around to him. I said, "Those are interesting targets. I know the holder of 3 of those titles reasonably well. He's been approached more than once and he doesn't sell. He tends to hold long." Donald was suddenly more interested. "You know who holds the one-quay corridor?" "I do, yes," Marcus said. "Father does some property management work. He'd know some of the smaller landlords through the trade." I looked at Marcus. Then I looked at Owen Brearley, who had his phone half out, with the air of a man already drifting towards a better conversation across the room. "Owen," I said, "I've been meaning to introduce myself properly for a long while. I own the building your firm leases its premises out of." Owen Brearley looked up from his phone. "One quay," I said. "Top 3 floors. 2,800 square meters. Larkin Holdings has held the title since 2010. Your current lease runs out in March." Owen stared at me. "He's looked at my company name on the renewal documents twice a decade for 15 years. "Hugh Larkin," I said. "Larkin Holdings Limited." The room didn't go quiet. Not all of it. But our particular corner of it did. Owen Brearley's face went through about 4 shifts in the space of 2 heartbeats. Marcus had stopped moving altogether. Donald Kerr was looking at me with the steady attention he hadn't given me 30 seconds earlier. Owen said, "I'm sorry. You're Hugh Larkin?" "The Hugh Larkin?" "The same." Marcus's voice, when it came out, was strange and flat. "Father, what are you talking about?" I turned to my son-in-law. "You lease your office space from me." "Marcus, you have done since the day you joined the firm. The building you go into every morning. The car park you walk through. Both mine." "That can't be, Father. Your name is Larkin." "I knew that. You'd never put it together. No reason you would have. I've never gone out of my way to advertise," Donald Kerr said quietly. "Larkin Holdings. You're the outfit that picked up the harbourside corridor in 2010. We are." He looked like he was running numbers in his head. "The whole portfolio, that's what? 60, 70 million? 74.2 on the last valuation," I said. "Give or take what the market does this quarter." Owen Brearley had gone the particular shade of pale that comes from understanding the size of a problem all at once. "Marcus, your father-in-law," Donald, was already digging out a business card. "Hugh, I'd genuinely love to sit down with you sometime. If you ever do consider a partial divestment, I appreciate that, Donald," I said. "I'm not currently looking to sell any of it." Marcus took my arm. He didn't grab it hard, but he did it without thinking. "Father, why didn't you? When we sent the letter. I lifted his hand off my elbow gently. "Marcus, you sent me a registered letter threatening legal action to remove me from my own house. You sent a builder onto my property without my knowledge. You brought your father into a plan to take an asset I built and paid for before you'd finished university. And you've spent 5 years of dinners across from me without ever once stopping to ask who I actually was. Father, I didn't know. You didn't ask." There's a difference between the two. Annabel had appeared at the edge of our small huddle, drawn over by whatever instinct it is that tells a daughter when something has gone wrong with her father in a room full of strangers. She looked at Marcus and at me, and at the look on Owen Brearley's face. And I saw the moment when she understood that something had shifted that wasn't going to shift back. "Father, what's going on?" I looked at my daughter, and I felt the thing I always felt looking at her, which was her mother, and the weight of everything Margaret had missed. "I'm explaining something I should have explained a long while ago," I said. I stayed another 20 minutes. I had 3 perfectly civil conversations about the waterfront portfolio, and I gave Donald Kerr my card, because he'd been the most honest of the 3 about what he wanted. Owen Brearley shook my hand 4 times in the space of 10 minutes, with the particular eagerness of a man working out he ought to have been more attentive for the past 5 years. Marcus stood by the window with a drink he wasn't touching and watched the lights moving on the harbor. When I left, Annabel walked me down to the foyer. She held my arm the way she used to when she was 8, and we crossed Lake Road in the rain. "Father," she said, "I need to talk to you. Not tonight, but soon." I told her she knew where I lived. She gave me a small, half-broken laugh and hugged me at the door, while expensively dressed accountants flowed past us. "I love you, Father," she said into my shoulder. "I love you too, my girl," I said. "That hasn't changed. That's never going to change." I drove home, made a cup of tea, sat on the veranda. Margaret's camellias were doing well. The Karakare blue ceiling caught the streetlight the way it always did, that soft, luminous pale that she'd held a paint chip up to one Saturday at the Mitre 10 inches Devonport, and said it looked like what a calm sky promised. I sat there a long time. Annabel rang me at 11 that night, and I let her talk for 40 minutes without putting a word in. She told me everything Marcus had said about the cottage, and the plan, and the conversations with his parents and the lawyer up in Christchurch. She told me she hadn't known about the letter until 2 days after it was sent. She told me she'd found out the previous week that Marcus had been having his own quiet conversations with a real estate agent about what they'd do with the Devonport property after they moved me on. She cried at that part. I told her the cottage was held in a trust that protected it from any outside claim. I told her Brendan Maytai Walters had structured it that way years ago for reasons that had nothing to do with Marcus. I told her she didn't need to lose any sleep over the cottage. She said she wasn't crying over the cottage. She was crying because she'd been at that table when Marcus called my life a situation, and she'd let him use the word, and she hadn't put a stop to it. I told her that was the conversation she and I needed to have. Not tonight. Tonight, she needed to go and have a conversation with her husband, and I needed to sleep. The next 2 weeks were quiet in the way the bush is quiet before a storm comes through the saddle. Owen Brearley rang Tapia on the Monday morning about the lease renewal. He was polite, professional, and very interested in our terms. Tapia told him we would be moving to current market rates, which represented a significant correction from the rate they'd been paying under their original lease. She was perfectly civil about it. It was a business decision, plain and simple. The firm had until the end of February to come back to us. Marcus, I heard through Annabel, was having a difficult couple of weeks. The other partners at Brearley Cox and Whitfield had become suddenly aware that the Larkin Holdings retainer, which generated a fair slice of the firm's commercial advisory work, was attached to the family of one of their own. There were closed-door meetings. Marcus, to his credit, hadn't blamed anyone but himself in any of them. That was something I noted and held on to. Geoffrey Pendleton rang me the second Saturday, which I hadn't been expecting. He was gruffer on the phone than he'd been across the lamb at Christmas, stripped of the good wine and the social performance. "Hugh," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." I asked him to be specific. He said the letter from Christchurch had been Marcus's idea, but that he, Geoffrey, had recommended the lawyer and had a hand in setting it up, and that he felt some responsibility for how it had been received. He said he hadn't understood the lay of the land. He said he should have spoken to me direct, man to man, instead of taking Marcus's word about my situation. It was as close to an apology as a man of his vintage was likely to get. I told him I appreciated the call, I told him I didn't hold the letter against him personally, provided it never happened a second time. He said it wouldn't. We hung up. I respected him a sliver more for having made the call himself rather than getting his wife to do it. Annabel came round on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the Northern Club. She came on her own, in jeans and an old jersey of her mother's that she'd kept after Margaret passed. The dark green wool, one that had been redarned at the cuff 3 times. She looked like herself in a way she didn't always when she was inside the version of her life that Marcus had built around them. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and said, "Father, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." I told her she'd always had one of those from me. She said, "Did you know we were planning to push you out of the cottage? Did you set all of this up because you already knew what we were planning?" I thought about it properly before I answered. I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't known the specifics. I'd known something was building. The unauthorized piles inspection, the conversation at Easter, the way Marcus had been measuring the cottage with his eyes for the better part of half a year. I'd seen the shape of it coming. I'd made sure I was set before it arrived. But I hadn't engineered it. I'd just been ready. She was quiet for a long while. She looked around the kitchen, at the high stud, at the original Scotia, at the window over the sink, where Margaret used to keep her herbs in the little terracotta pots she got from a market in Matakana. Annabel had quietly replaced them the year after we lost her mother. There were 3 pots of basil and a struggling thyme up there. "Father," she said, "why didn't you tell us about the company? About the money? Not because you owed us, just why?" I wrapped both hands round my mug and tried to find the words I'd been trying to find for 11 years. "Your mother and I talked about it a fair bit after you came along. We'd both grown up in families where we watched what money did to people we cared about, not always in the obvious ways. Sometimes it was just a softening, where the hard edges of life stopped reaching them, where they stopped having to figure things out for themselves, because there was always a cushion underneath. Your mom and I didn't want that for you. We wanted you to know what things cost, what it felt like to work for something, what it meant to build something out of not very much. We thought that mattered more than knowing your dad could write a check for any problem you ever brought home." She said, "But you did pay for things. The wedding." I said, "That was different." She gave me a small smile. "Father, you can't just decide on your own what's different. That's not how it works." "Fair enough," I said. "Your mum would have said the same thing." She looked at the time. She was still for a moment. "I had a real conversation with Marcus last night. Not the one where we both manage what the other one hears. A proper one." I waited. He said he was ashamed. Not the lawyer kind of ashamed where you say the word and explain why. The actual kind. He said he'd spent so long building a professional version of himself around being the cleverest person in the room that he stopped questioning his own assumptions. He looked at your ute and your swandry, and the fact that you drink Speight's instead of Pinot Noir, and he made a judgment, and he never bothered to revisit it. Not even when the evidence was sitting in the lobby of his own building. On the directory. In the lease he signed. She paused. He said the worst part isn't what he tried to do. The worst part is that he did it without ever really asking who you were. He said you've been his father-in-law for 5 years, and if a stranger had asked him to describe you, he could have told them what you drove and what you wore. That was about the limit of it. He said he doesn't actually know you at all. I let that sit between us a moment. That's the most honest thing Marcus has ever said about himself, I said. She nodded. I know. I got up and topped up her tea. I asked if she'd had any breakfast. She said no, and I scrambled some eggs the way Margaret used to do them, with cracked pepper and a scrape of cheddar, and we ate at the kitchen table without saying much for a while. The Saturday morning light came in through the kitchen window and caught the herbs and the worn cowrie and the particular quality of the quiet you get in a house that's been properly lived in for a long time. After a bit, Annabel said, Marcus wants to come and talk to you, Father. If you're prepared to have him. I said the door wasn't locked. She went home around midday. I watched her walk down the path to her car, the sensible little Mazda she drove herself, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for months. Marcus came round the next Sunday. He knocked instead of pressing the bell, which I noticed. He was wearing a plain shirt and jeans, no professional plumage on him, and he had the slightly disarmed look of a man who decided not to drive the conversation before it started. I let him in. We sat in the front room. He started talking before I'd fully sat down. He said he'd been trying to imagine what he'd have done if the positions had been reversed. If he'd been the one with the cottage and the history, and a stranger had written him a letter telling him to vacate. He said he'd thought about it for a long time, and he still couldn't work out how he'd justified it to himself in the first place. He said the justification at the time had been that he was helping, that he was being practical, that he was doing what sensible people did with capital. He said he understood now that what he'd actually been doing was telling himself a story where he was the capable man and I was the burden, because that story sat more comfortably than the alternative, which was that he hadn't bothered to ask the question at all. I said, "Marcus, do you know what made you capable?" He looked up at me. I said, "Every leg up you've had, somebody put it under you. The firm that recruited you out of the University of Auckland. Somebody built that firm. The clients who put their trust in you. Somebody earned that trust before you walked through the door. The building you practice out of. Somebody spent a working lifetime making it worth practicing out of. Most of the structure of the life you reckon you built yourself was put there by people you never thought to ask after. Like you," he said, "not just me. Like everyone who came before you. In every room you've walked into feeling you had a right to be there. I'm not telling you this to take anything off you. You're good at your work. I've made inquiries. I've heard the right things. But being good at your work and being entitled to the lot are not the same animal. The first one you've earned. The second one you're going to have to give up." He nodded. His hands were clasped between his knees. He said, "Father, I need to ask you something else. The lease renewal. Is it going to be a problem for the firm?" He wasn't asking on his own behalf. He said it without dressing it up. He said Owen Brearley and the partners were worried. And he wanted the truth so he could stop trying to manage their anxiety. I told him the lease renewal would come in at fair market rate. Full stop. That it had nothing to do with what had passed between him and me, and everything to do with the fact that I'd been carrying his firm at a generous rate for years and that needed correcting regardless. I told him no one at the firm would lose their job over our family situation, and that the firm's professional work for Larkin Holdings would carry on so long as that work continued to be done properly. I told him I was capable of separating business from personal, and I expected him to be the same. He said, "Thank you." Said it plain. I said, "Marcus, how's your workload at the moment?" He said it was solid. I told him Larkin Holdings would be looking at restructuring the financing on 3 of its medical center titles in the autumn, and we'd be putting that work out for proposal. I told him Brendan handled my personal estate, but the corporate financial advisory work was up for a fresh look. I told him if he was interested, he should put a proposal together and have it on Tapaya's desk by the end of the month, and that it would be assessed on its merits, the same as anyone else's. He stared at me. "Father, why on earth would you?" "Because you're good at your work," I said. "And because I'd rather give a piece of work to a man I know than a stranger, provided the work itself is worth the giving." He said he didn't deserve the chance. I said, "Probably not, but I'm not offering it because you deserve it. I'm offering it because Annabel loves you, and because Margaret used to say the measure of a man wasn't what he did when things were going his way. It was what he did when he'd been properly knocked back on his heels and had to start putting himself together again from scratch." I told him this was his ground-level moment, and I was interested to see what he built from it. He was quiet a long while. When he spoke, his voice had come down out of the professional register into something underneath. He said he was sorry, not for the consequences of what he'd done, or the awkwardness at the firm, or any of the things that had a price on them. He said he was sorry for having looked at me for 5 years and decided he already knew what I was. He said that was the thing he was most ashamed of. And he understood, if I never properly trusted him again, but that he was going to spend a long time trying to earn his way back into being worth standing alongside in this family. I looked at my son-in-law for a fair stretch. I thought about Margaret and what she'd have said, which I knew because I'd known her for 31 years. She'd have said people are nearly always capable of being better than the worst thing they've done, provided they're prepared to put the work in. She'd have said holding a door open for a man trying to walk through it isn't softness. She'd have said, Hugh, let the boy have a go. I told Marcus he could start by coming to Sunday lunch the week after next. He said he would. He stood up, and at the door he turned and said, Father, whatever I build from here, I want it to be something I built knowing what was actually under my feet. I told him that was a fair start. He left. I walked through the cottage. The kari floors and the karakari blue glimpsed through the doorway out to the veranda. The camellias along the front path, getting properly woody now at the base. The workshop out the back where I'd built and repaired and spent the better part of my adult life sorting out who I was in the gaps between work and being a husband and being a father and grieving. I ran my hand along the kitchen bench, the same bench I'd built with Annabel sitting on the bench saw stool when she was 6, asking if she could pass me the tape, and I'd let her. And she'd dropped it, and we'd laughed. I thought about the man I'd been at Marcus's age, 35 and certain about the world, full of the particular confidence that comes before life has taken enough off you to make you humble. I thought about the people I'd underestimated when I was that age, and the lessons that had cost me before I learnt them. The company hadn't made me. The company was the record of who I'd already become before I built it. Same with the cottage and the ute and the folding ruler in my back pocket I kept by habit. None of it was a performance. All of it was just my actual life, lived the way Margaret and I had decided we'd live it together, without needing anyone else to sign off on the terms. The Sunday after next, they came round for lunch. Marcus wore jeans again. Annabel brought a posy of late camellias from her own garden, the same way I always took flowers to family lunches, and I caught something in the look she gave me as she handed them over. A small private acknowledgement that said she finally understood what the gesture had meant for 40 years. They stayed 3 hours. Marcus asked about the harbourside development, and listened, properly listened, without steering the talk back to himself. Annabel made her mother's pavlova from memory, and got the cream just right. When they left, Marcus shook my hand at the door. The shake was different from the shakes I'd had off him for 5 years. Less performance in it. More weight. I watched their taillights disappear up the street, and I went back inside and rang Tapaya and asked her to set up the autumn refinancing review for the second week of March. Then I went out to the veranda and sat under the blue ceiling and thought about Margaret the way I do most evenings, although less with the heavy grief of the early years and more with the easy company of someone who's gone but whose presence is layered into everything you walk past, the camellias and the painted ceiling and the pavlova recipe a daughter has by heart and the particular angle of late summer light on the kari floor. I thought about what I'd told Donald Kerr at the Northern Club when he asked what my plans were for the portfolio. Not looking to sell. That was still true. I'd built it to keep. Not as an inheritance. Not as leverage. Not as a number to drop in rooms full of people who measured a man's worth by his statement. I'd built it because building was what I knew how to do. And because Margaret had believed I could. And because there'd been a wet Tuesday in July of 1992 when I'd had $86 in the checking account and a baby daughter and a wife who was teaching Primer 1 for not enough money, and I'd made myself a quiet promise about what the rest of my life was going to look like. The rest of my life looks like this. A freehold cottage in Devonport. A ute with a dent in the tailgate. A folding ruler in the back pocket of my trousers. A daughter who finally knows who her father is. And a son-in-law who's been given the chance to learn before it's too late, which is a chance not every young man in his position gets, and one I hope he does something with. If I've learnt anything worth passing on to anyone watching this, it's a few small things. And I'll lay them out for you the way my father laid them out for me. The first one is this: don't let anyone tell you the work you do quietly doesn't count. The best things you'll ever build in your life are the ones you build when no one's keeping score. The man who needs an audience for his worth has already shown the audience he's not sure of it himself. The second one is this: raise your children to know what things cost. Not because you can't afford to soften the corners for them, but because the corners are how they'll learn the shape of the world they're walking into. And softening them too early makes them unprepared for a life that was never going to be soft in the first place. The third one is this: be careful who you marry, and be careful who your children marry. But understand that you can't steer a daughter away from a man by telling her he's the wrong one. You can only steer her by raising her well enough that she works it out for herself in time, and trusting that if she doesn't, you'll still be standing where she left you when she comes back to ask. And the last one is this: when a man does you a wrong, you have a choice in front of you. And the choice isn't between revenge and weakness. The choice is between making him smaller and giving him the chance to become larger than what he did. The first one feels good for an evening. The second one is what changes a family for a generation. I'm not telling you which one to pick. I'm telling you those are the two that are actually on offer. No matter what the films would have you believe. If you've made it this far, leave me a comment and tell me where in New Zealand you're listening from. I read every one of them, and whatever it is you've built, whether the room knows about it or not, whether there's a plaque on it somewhere, or just a quiet ceiling, painted the color of a calm sky, don't let anyone shrink it to fit their idea of what a man your age should be. Most of the world is being lived by people the room has already overlooked. I've been one of them my whole working life, and I'll tell you for nothing, it's the best place to be standing when the truth eventually comes out.